are their customers. But what about the actual customers, the shoppers seeking out wine and pizzas, the drivers looking for fuel? When is that moment when panic buying kicks in? What drives it, sustains it? And what can be done to stop a dangerous cascade effect? How do you stop people losing their heads when all around others are losing theirs? Well, we're joined by Professor Jose Arturo Garza-Reyes, Head of the Centre for Supply Chain Improvement at the University of Derby, and Julian Jessup, economist and Telegraph columnist. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time. Professor, if I can start with you, as a specialist looking at supply chains, they've been criticised over the last year and a half, but they clearly have advantages for businesses. Do they have advantages for consumers too?
I mean, it has been a very difficult situation for consumers because of all these shortages that we have had. You were particularly mentioning about the just-in-time approach which has been prevalent in supply chain over the last 30 or 40 years. That clearly has advantages for organizations. I mean, the leaner the supply chains, the more efficient they will be, the cost can be reduced. Now, does that have an advantage for consumer? Probably not as much as the advantage for organizations. Obviously, the cheaper the supply chains are to run, the cheaper the product can get into the shelf of the supermarket. That probably could be the main advantage that the consumer will be feeling. If you remove the just-in-time, yes, supply chains are going to be more robust. They are going to be less prone to disruption, but probably that will also increase the price of the product. It's like an insurance that we will need to pay.
Yeah, and that's, Julian Jessup, it's worth reflecting on. There's a lot of talk of inflation rising at the moment. Supply chains, good supply chains, efficient supply chains keep wholesale and ultimately the prices on shelves down. That's to be welcomed. But when there is a crisis, you wonder if they really are resilient enough. Oh, it's a shame. No, Julian, I'm afraid we can't hear you. We're going to just play with a few buttons and see if we can. Are you plugged in? I wonder. Tell you what, Julian, just have a little fiddle with what you've got there, and we'll go back to the professor to reflect on the robustness or otherwise of some of our supply chains right now. And Professor, there's a particular problem it's suggested with lorries. There's a shortage of drivers. They're retiring. There's a shortage of EU drivers who are able to drive in the UK. Is that the critical part of the chain that's struggling?
Is one of those ones. I mean, there are many aspects in the supply chains that will struggle, particularly with this the situation that we have. Obviously, the retirement age of the lorry drivers is one of those, but I mean, it's up to organizations to make sure that younger drivers are trained and able and capable to actually take those vacant positions at the moment. So I could consider probably that as one of the weaknesses, but there are many others at the moment that have played a role in the customer seeing some empty market, shelf in the market. I mean, apart from the heat, apart from this problem that you are talking about, the strategies that companies have been following, as I mentioned, over the last 33 to 40 years, have been more oriented toward cost reduction as opposed to make supply chains more resilient. I mean, I can see now with the pandemic that we have had since pretty much March last year, that companies little by little have been changing the way in which they are managing supply chains. And we can also see that many of them are taking different types of strategies, implementing, formulating them to actually try to overcome these particular issues of resilience that they have been facing lately.
Julian Jessup, I think we've got the microphone working. You were saying?
Yes, sorry. Well, I was saying that I'm still a fan of these global supply chains. So by and large, actually, they've held up pretty well during the pandemic. Often there's been a bigger problem, people getting to their local shops because of social distancing restrictions and lockdown, rather than the shops themselves being supplied with the goods that people want to buy. So there's another advantage of these big supply chains is that they allow people to source goods and services from all different types of supplier. If you're overly dependent on a single local supplier, then that can actually be potentially more damaging. So I think it's too soon to abandon the just-in-time supply chain model completely. But this is undoubtedly a huge shock, and it's been compounded by various other things that are going on. There are lots of labour shortages generally at the moment, partly because many people are still locked in furlough furlough. Brexit has had a small impact, not as big, I think, as some people think, but that's restricted labour supply in some industries. So in a sense, we've had a perfect storm, which I think will prompt some companies to rethink the way they organise themselves. But I don't think it's necessarily a reason to throw the whole model away.
No, Julian, I remember thinking back to my A-level economics, there was always a case made for strategic industries, wasn't there? That there were certain things you as a country probably shouldn't be looking to import. You needed to have them made domestically. PPE would be a good example of that. But by your analysis, there's another angle to it, which is actually what you need is lots of supply chains scattered all around the world. Just in case you can't make your own PPE, you might be able to get some from South America rather than China or India or America. What the argument is actually for more supply chains.
Well, I think the strategic importance argument is often overstated. I mean, you could argue it of almost any good that it's essential and therefore we have to supply it at home. But there's literally a trade-off here that if you do have loads of global suppliers, then you have competing companies trying to sell you things. And I think PPE is a good example of this. I mean, some people are arguing we should have had an enormous amount of spare capacity sitting around at home just in case we needed to supply people with an enormous amount of PPE. What we're actually able to do was to buy it from countries like China and Turkey that do have the capacity and the expertise. So I don't think that that's necessarily a great example of spare capacity we need to have sitting around just in case. I think it's better to have a broad range of options, and if that means importing quite a lot from overseas, then so be it.
Yeah. Professor, a final thought, if you would, just on what I said there in introduction about panic buying. At what point, that tipping point, when it comes how people behave, are we seeing that yet? What's the human psychology behind it when people stop being just prudential and become panic-stricken?
Well, unfortunately, something that we have seen again during the pandemic. From my point of view, this has been unreasonable from people, but it's very understandable at the same time because they do not know how resilient supply chains are. And because of that reason, they behave in that particular way. It has been taught a lot, the fact that shelves were empty during the first lockdown, but as you could see, it didn't get to any critical point. So by this stage, we should already have the experience that the panic buying is not the way to go forward, that supply chains may struggle a little bit, but that they are resilient enough to actually cope with the situation. Organizations are not just going to stand still and see the empty shelves. They are going to be taking action. The government is going to be taking action, and actually they did it. They implemented and formulated different strategies. Again, as we could see, although there were empty shelves, it didn't get to any critical point, I would say.
Professor Reyes and Julian Jessup, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. After the break.